Hello, my name is Desmond Lynch. I'm 23 years old and I want to be a filmmaker. I recently made a short audio drama called Be Afraid of the Dark, The Girl in Orion, and I'd like to tell you about it. Development. I've been playing around with this idea for quite some time. Always been writing bits and pieces, but never getting anywhere really. It only really took off back in March 2020 when the first lockdown happened. That time I just had a lot of time on my hands, so I just started writing up some stuff, wrote a few scripts, and even tried recording some stuff, but none of it was very good. I got disinterested or just got too busy doing other stuff, so I just let it sit and never got back to it. A few years later, I got back in the groove of making things. I learned how to edit better, how to record sound better, how to write better, so I decided to start making stuff. I made a few short films alongside some audio projects I done on the side. The biggest thing I've done so far is my podcast, The Witch in the Orchard. That I spent quite a bit of my own money hiring out studio space and paying actors to perform. I've finished editing 2 out of the 3 episodes, soon to finish the third, and I'm also pitching it to various podcast networks to see if they would be interested in hosting it. I'm waiting for word back from them. Put a hold on editing the third episode temporarily, as I was distracted by this recent project, Be Afraid of the Dark. Be Afraid of the Dark is the story that follows a private detective called Damien. He's kind of like this troubled young man, very anxious, very traumatized. He has an alcohol problem, and he's just struggling to get by in this really bad shithole city. His whole deal is that ever since he was a kid, he could see ghosts. In this world, it's not a cool thing to see ghosts. It isn't fun. He's really just seeing the remains of a lot of hurt and angry people in their very worst moment. So there's like a lot of loneliness and despair in this, especially since Damien is the only person he's ever known to be able to see ghosts. Everywhere he goes, he sees horrible stuff like this, and the only way he's been able to deal with it is to learn magic and like find a way to talk to them, reason with them, and oftentimes just goes out of his way to bring them to peace. So they just leave and he doesn't have to see them anymore. It's a noble endeavor, but it's ultimately, driven by his own pain and selfishness. His want to never see this stuff again, which makes for an interesting character. In regards to tone, there's a lot of influences. I think one of the biggest influences for me personally was stuff like, Batman black and white motion comic series that they developed like a decade ago. I'm quite a big Batman fan, and I just found watching these as a kid, they were just fucking great. There's also stuff like, Blade Runner and Jessica Jones, other noir stuff like that. The show Supernatural played a big role in its influence, especially like the first 5 series. I felt like that direction they had in those early years was very gritty, very real. I thought its lore was very tight packed and compelling. The show also had like one of the best pilots I've ever seen as well. It actually plays a minor influence on the Ghost of the Working Girl as a deal for Woman in White. The Woman in White, also known as the White Lady, is a type of ghost myth present in various countries around the world. It's typically spotted in rural areas, so a young woman in a white dress who either speaks or is incapable of speech. Typically focuses on a young woman who's died under horrifying or tragic circumstances. Some of these stories will have a woman, killed by her husband or father, or others will have her die by suicide. Again, very tragic deaths, kind of taboo situations, which lead to hushed gossip and speculation as to the reasons or cause that inevitably fuel an environment of superstition, which is where supposed ghost sightings of a woman in a white dress come from. The Lady in Red is more resonant example of the ghost of the working girl. The Lady in Red, or the Red Lady, is very similar to the Lady in White. However, they differ because the ghosts of these women who are prostitutes or other things like that, they wear a red dress but otherwise do the same type of thing. All died by murder or suicide. Very tragic, very taboo deaths. Again, leading to speculation, which eventually delves into superstition, which breeds an environment where ghost sightings occur. Basically, for the working girl, I combined those two ghost archetypes into one. Various ghost stories have the ghost be mistaken for a living person at first, which you get here initially with the working girl. So obviously the cars begin, driving through her. She's silent because of the shock and trauma of the situation, but also because, production limitations and other stuff like that. You get to see 2 types of ghosts. You get the working girl, who is very recent, who is hurting but a lot more put together. They resemble a person who's alive and can be mistaken for a person who's still living if you didn't notice signs. Then you have Gore, who is a ghost that's been dead for decades and like has lost a lot of his true self. He's basically becoming this like weird nightmarish ghoul thing, so he's like very much incapable of being mistaken for a real living person. Gore is the ghost of a gangster who haunted a comedy club where he was murdered. It's never really elaborated on in the story, but Damien worked a case in that club before it was demolished. He met Gore and became friendly with him. Gore is an interesting character because he's like, the only ghost that Damien doesn't want to put to rest because, he's so viable to his own endeavors. Gore doesn't want to rest either because he he's feared he'd just go to hell anyway. So the two came to this agreement. Damien took a piece of the floorboard of the comedy cellar so that Gore could inhabit it and accompany Damien on his adventures. The magic stuff was simple enough, like a lot of blood ritual stuff. The magic words, for the most part, are just bits of dialogue I wrote and then verse, kind of like as a Tanner rule of magic. Magic is simplistic for the most part, very few rules or components laid out. Story-wise, it's all pretty simple. It only takes place in a few locations. Back alley, a street, a shady motel, that's about it. It's a detective story that feels very personal because the supernatural elements actually allow for the detective to experience the sensation of dying. Having to go through that again and again and again makes for a really damaged and interesting character that I wanted to explore. So development properly began about a week or two ago. I went out to the shop to get my weekly food supply, and on the way back, I kept thinking how I had to get the edit for the orchard done and a bunch of other stuff, and I just kept thinking about Be Afraid of the Dark and how I could just get it done in less than a week, and so I just did that. So I literally just got home, started writing up again. I basically redrafted the pilot. Basically redrafted the episode 1, took out the 10-minute intro, basically reworked that into a wee short story, and that's basically what we got here. And I finished writing that in about a day, and I got to producing it soon after. Production. Production definitely is a mixed bag for me. I definitely like making things with other people. I like getting good performances out of actors and the feeling that you've come together to create something that's true and resonant. However, when you're recording by yourself, you don't really have that experience. The entire concept of this audio project was that it was just something I could do by myself in my closet. That's why there's only one narrator, only one character has any dialogue that goes to the working girl, doesn't have any lines because I don't have to explain to you why it's a bad idea to invite a woman over to your house and ask her to record in your bedroom closet. That's the entire scenario is just so dodgy, it's not worth all the goodwill in the world. My closet in my bedroom is where I set up the mic. I use the Rode NTG2. It's mostly only good for boom operator jobs that I get now and again, but for this project it was serviceable. There's a lot of coats and the space is confined, so we got some decent soundproofing. There were some minor issues occasionally when you get flatmates running up and down the stairs or old pipes churning away or cars down the street, but it's nothing I couldn't fix in post. The main issue was just reading the entire damn thing. I'm not an actor, certainly not a voice actor. Anyone who's met me would assume I was either a serial killer or I'd, gone for the Witcher trials. I just don't have a lot of emotional resonance. So I tried to have this deep, general American accent when I recorded narration. I slipped up a few times, but I thought overall it was an acceptable performance given my lack of experience. I did that for just about 3 to 4 hours over the course of 2 days. It was a really uncomfortable experience, just being stuck in a closet. Early summer, just messing up lines one after another. You just lose your temper very quickly, so I had to take regular breaks. But I got through it. The dialogue for Damien, which I also did, was a lot easier. I recorded all his lines in 10 minutes, and that was a lot more fun. It was less focused on pronunciation and audibility and clarity and more on emotional resonance, which is more interesting. I also did the breathing noises for Gore, which was cool as well. At the end of the day, I was glad to be over and done with it. I recorded about 42 sound files, all of which were backed up on various hard drives, online backups, and other devices. You can never have enough backups, any data wrangler will tell you that. And once post was done, I started editing. Post-production. The editing process took a lot longer than I expected. I had maybe 3 to 4 hours of audio I had to churn through. Then I had to cut that down to just 20 or so minutes, decide which takes and which lines were best, and then stitch them together for the rough cut. Going through the sound, there were some minor issues. You had, some sound effects that were clipped or distorted. So certain lines were just, practically useless and had to be replaced with other takes. Also, mic axes or just the position of the mic played a big role, as does the pacing of the voice. Again, production was quite rushed because it was just an uncomfortable experience for me reading as a narrator. So I just wanted to get it over and done with. For the rough cut, I adjusted the pitch of my narration, taking it down about a semitone. I was concerned the listener would catch on it was me doing both voices of the narrator and Damien, so I just tried my best to differentiate them. For Damien, I played around with the idea of heightening his pitch, but ultimately just stayed with my original voice. Gore's breathing, I EQ'd it and changed the pitch to have this weird ethereal quality to it. For the orchard, I'd purchased about 200 plus music files and hundreds of of royalty-free sound effects that I'd use for that edit. This time around, while I did use many of those same sound effects, music-wise, I had to look elsewhere. The Orchard was very classical, very fantasy-based score. Be Afraid of the Dark is at its very core a noir detective story, so there's more modern influences, very grim and broody stuff that suit the genre better score-wise. I looked around and found about 6 or 7 different royalty-free songs that were good and usable. A lot of royalty-free stuff is just not very good, but like when you find a good one, it's very good. I was very lucky to find about 3 or 4 songs that I used that were really good. I made sure to credit them in the description below the video. Sound mixing wise, Be Afraid of the Dark is a lot more complex than I initially set out for it to be. Having finished up editing the first 2 episodes of Orchard, I'm used to working with like this 45-minute long track with 24 tracks, dialogue, and sound effects all over the place. This project, it was a lot smaller, a lot simpler, but still very complex in parts. An example being ambience, the background sound, car horns, traffic, rain, that type of shit. That was a big concern. I wanted to make the city feel alive and real but not too distracting. So there's cars in the background, but there's like no passers-by, no drunks in the street, none of that stuff. Rain was a central component to the story. It's pathetic fallacy. It means to set the tone of the story, and it's quite suitable for the genre as well. Actually, adjusting the levels for the rain was quite interesting. The recent Matt Reeves Batman movie had an interesting sound mixing technique in how they adjusted sound in certain scenes. Quite a lot of rain in that movie, and in certain scenes that ambience is very present, but then it's cut out. An example being when Batman is shot at by the Penguin. The rain ambience is cut out almost entirely, making the gunshots sound louder and more fatal. I tried similar techniques with the sound mix for this audio drama. Scenes like the flashbacks to the murder, I cut out rain entirely, added some weird reverb effects to the street ambience to make it sound more distant and ethereal. I also added this neon light sound effect that kind of resembled the sound of an old-time projector, which was really cool too. A lot of thought went into the sounds, the levels of every sound effect. Audibility of the dialogue and narration was the biggest concern, so they had to be the loudest. Everything else had to be a lot quieter so it wasn't too intense or distracting. There are limitations to an audio-only medium, so there's certain sounds that I just didn't bother putting in. An example being Damien's footsteps, stuff like that would have just been difficult to edit because it's all about timing and there's no visual reference, so you can't match it with anything. The lack of a visual reference meant that I didn't need to include that many sound effects either, because without the visual reference there's no explanation as to where the sound comes from, so it would just be there to cause a distraction to the audience. The main concern was having sound effects that were relevant to what was going on in the story. When Damien cuts himself to cast a spell, there's a sound effect for that. Hear his heavy breathing, his grunts of pain, it makes it more real. Then there's the magic stuff, kind of use the same sound effects again and again. It's a short audio project, so I didn't want to introduce too much weird stuff. Having been introduced to those sounds, the viewer will register what they mean sonically. Music again was all royalty-free stuff that I found online. I made sure to give them proper credit in the description. The image I used was free as well. I found it online. I used Google Images to find copyright-free images that'd be ideal for the project. Originally, I was just going to post it on SoundCloud and other audio-only platforms. However, I was concerned with the basic quality of narration as well as the speaking pace of the voice, which would be too quick and difficult to understand. So I went about making a video version with subtitles. I think I worked on this edit for about 4 or 5 days, give or take. There's some rough edges, but for the most part, I think it's an acceptable product. Conclusion. For these types of projects, I try my best to live by Hank Green's advice on giving 80% of what you have, not 100%, because 100% you have no idea what that looks like. Spend years working on a project and think you're only putting in 99%, thinking that 1% makes all the difference. 80% you have a rough idea of what that looks like. With 80% you can finish a project better, faster, and you can make more projects soon after. And with each project you get better, more efficient, more skilled. You will eventually come to a point where your 80% is better than someone else's 100%. For this project, I definitely put in 80%. I think the pacing is the biggest issue of the entire thing. Again, production was a bit rushed on account of just how uncomfortable it was to record, but I made the best of what I had and got it done in my own personal deadline. With these types of narrative stories, the goal is to discern or explore an emotion or a vibe. If you make a comedy and nobody laughs, it's a bad movie. If you make an action movie and people are bored watching it, it's a bad movie. With this project, I felt genuinely disturbed listening back to certain scenes, like the murder scene and the first appearance of the working girl ghost. If I felt that and I'm more familiar with this project than anyone ever will be, then I'm sure someone who's only watched it once will feel that way too. What's next? I'm going back to work on The Witch in the Orchard, finishing up episode 3. I'm also producing another audio short with a voice actor buddy of mine, so that'll be fun. I'm also at some point looking to adapt Be Afraid of the Dark into a proper podcast series. I've actually already sent in a pitch to a network, so I hope to hear back from them soon. I got a bunch of other projects I'm working on, both stuff I'm making myself as well as stuff I'm doing for other people. In the meantime, I'm gonna keep working on stuff and I'll be sure to keep you posted when I do.